The cold gets into you in a way you can't explain, a deep ache that settles in your bones and never really leaves, even now, 50 years later. You remember the cold more than the fear sometimes. It was always there, that Russian winter of 43. The wind didn't just blow. It sliced right through your greatcoat, through your wool tunic, right down to your soul. Your breath would freeze on your scarf, your eyebrows crusted with ice, and the metal of your rifle felt like it would tear the skin right off your fingers if you weren't careful. We were retreating, always retreating then. The word from high command was always about strategic repositioning, but to us, down in the mud and the snow, it just felt like running. Running from the Siberian divisions, from the T-34s that seemed to come out of the blizzards themselves, from the endless, grim determination of the Red Army. We defought a sharp little action that morning, a rearguard thing, just enough to slow them down so the main column could get away. The firing stopped as suddenly as it started, that eerie quiet that falls over a battlefield, broken only by the moaning of the wounded and the crackle of a burning half-track. The smoke from the shells hung low in the still, frigid air, mixing with the smell of cordite and snow. My hands were shaking, not from fear anymore, but from the adrenaline leaving my body, leaving me empty and trembling. That's when I saw him. He was just a kid, couldn't have been more than 18, lying face down in a drift of clean, white snow that was turning pink around him. One of ours, a guy named Klaus, was going through the pockets of the dead, looking for cigarettes or food, the usual. He rolled this Soviet boy over with his boot, and something fluttered out of an unbuttoned pocket. A letter. It was just a folded piece of paper, already soaking up the bloody slush. Klaus grunted, disappointed it wasn't a pack of Mackhawker, and moved on. But I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was such a small, fragile thing in all that madness. A piece of paper. This boy, this enemy I was supposed to hate, had been carrying a letter. Probably from his mother or a sweetheart back in some village I'd never heard of. It meant everything to him, and now it meant nothing, just litter on the ground. The whole world was burning, empires were clashing, and here was this last, quiet word from a life that had just been snuffed out. I didn't even think about it, not really. It was an impulse, a small rebellion against the utter destruction all around us. While the others were looting watches and boots, I bent down, my knees cracking in the cold, and I picked up that sodden letter. I wiped the mud and blood off on my trousers, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the inside pocket of my tunic, right over my heart. It felt like a secret already, a heavy one. That letter stayed with me for the rest of the war. It became a part of my uniform as much as my dog tags or my soul budge. Through the long, freezing retreats, the chaotic battles where you couldn't tell friend from foe, the hunger that gnawed at your belly until it was a dull, constant pain, that letter was there. I could feel it crinkle against my chest with every step I took. It was my strange, silent penance. I'd shot at men like him, thrown grenades at men like him. We were told they were subhuman, a Bolshevik horde, but this boy had a mother who wrote him letters. At night, huddled in some frozen foxhole with my buddies, listening to the artillery rumble in the distance, I'd sometimes take it out when I thought no one was looking. By the faint light of a dying match or the moon reflecting off the snow, I'd stare at the Cyrillic script. I couldn't read a word of it, of course. The letters were just strange, curling shapes like little footprints in the snow. But I'd imagine what it said. I'd imagine a farmhouse, much like my own parents' place, but colder, bigger. I'd imagine a mother telling him about the cow, or how his sister was doing in school, telling him to stay warm, to be careful, to come home soon. The same things my own mother wrote to me. The guilt was a funny thing. It wasn't a sharp guilt, not like if I'd done something cowardly. It was a dull, aching weight. This boy was dead, and I was alive, and I was carrying the last piece of him. I felt connected to him in a way I didn't feel connected to my own officers, or even to some of the new replacements who showed up with fresh faces and empty eyes. We shared something. Him and I, we both knew the cold, the fear, the taste of stale army bread. We both had people we missed desperately. The only difference was, I was still breathing, and I was carrying his ghost in my pocket. We joked about death, you know. You had to. There was a dark humor that got you through the day. When a shell landed close and covered you in dirt, you'd laugh and say, "Well, they're not paying me enough to dig graves too." When a buddy's helmet got shot right off his head, we call him lucky and tell him he owed us all a drink. But you never joked about the letters from home. Those were sacred. Getting a letter was like getting a piece of your old life handed to you. You'd find a quiet corner if such a thing existed, and you'd read it slowly, savoring every word, tracing the handwriting with your finger. You could smell home on the paper sometimes, a faint scent of soap or the kitchen. I saw big, tough men break down crying over a letter. I saw men get a Dear John letter, where their girl had found someone else, and they'd just go quiet for days, a different kind of wounded. So I knew what this letter in my pocket meant. I knew its power. In carrying it felt like I was guarding something holy, a last testament that had to be delivered. It was a duty I'd given myself, a mission that made more sense than any order we got from the high-ups. My real mission was just to survive, to see my parents again, to walk in a forest that wasn't full of death. But this was something else. This was about preserving a tiny shred of decency in the middle of hell. War ended for me in a field hospital west of Berlin, with the sounds of the Russians getting closer and the Americans already on us. The world was just noise and confusion. When I finally made it home, it was to a different country, defeated, broken, ashamed. We didn't talk about the war. You shoved it down deep, you got a job, you tried to rebuild. I married a wonderful woman, a girl who had waited for me, and we had children. I never told her about the letter. I never told anyone. It went into a small wooden box on my dresser, along with my iron cross, which I never wore, and a few faded photographs of my buddies, the ones who didn't make it. The box was like a coffin for that part of my life. But every time I opened that drawer to get a pair of socks, I'd see it. The paper had yellowed, the ink had faded to a soft brown, but it was still there. It was my secret shame and my secret duty. As the years went by and my hair turned white and I became a grandfather, the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger, the need to finish it. The war was a history book to my grandchildren, black and white photos of men in funny helmets. But to me, it was still that boy's face in the snow. It was the weight in my pocket. I'd had a whole lifey, a good life, a happy life, but this one thing was left undone. I'd wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking I could hear the wind howling across the steppe, and I'd see that piece of paper fluttering down. My wife passed away, God rest her soul, and the house got quieter. The past got louder. I knew I was an old man. I didn't have much time left, and I couldn't go to my grave with this weight still on me. I had to try. So, 50 years after I picked it up, I decided to go back. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? An old German man traveling to Russia, to a city that had been Stalingrad, with a name and a faded letter as my only map. My children thought I'd lost my mind. "Papa, it's too dangerous," they said. "What if they're still angry? What will you even say?" But I had to. I hired a translator, a young student named Anya, and I told her the story. She listened with wide eyes, this piece of history coming to life in her university cafe. With her help, we started the search. The letter was addressed to a private Alexei Petrov, and it was from his mother, Anna, in a village called Steria Derevnya. We found out the village was still there, not far from Volgograd. Writing that first letter to the local postmaster was one of the hardest things I've ever done. How do you explain such a thing? "Dear sir, 50 years ago, I found a letter on a dead Soviet soldier. I'm the man who probably killed him." Anya helped me phrase it gently. We waited for weeks. I almost hoped we'd hear nothing, that the trail had gone cold, so I could say I'd tried and failed. But then a reply came. The postmaster, a kind man, had asked around the older folks in the village. He wrote that an Anna Petrov had indeed lived there, but she had passed away 10 years earlier. However, she had a daughter, Svetlana, Alexei's sister, who still lived in the same house. My heart was pounding in my chest, a drumbeat from 1943. Svetlana was alive. We wrote to her and she agreed to meet me. The journey to that village was the longest of my life, longer than the retreat from Moscow. The landscape from the train window was flat and endless, and for a moment I was a young soldier again, scared and cold. The smells were different, but the vastness of the sky was the same. Anya was with me, a steadying presence. When we got to the village, it was just a quiet, dusty place with small wooden houses. We found the address. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the gate. An old woman came to the door, her face lined with a lifetime of hardship. She looked at me, a stranger, an old German man with suspicion in her eyes. Anya explained who I was and why I was there. I didn't wait. I just took the letter in its plastic sleeve to protect it, and I held it out to her. I pointed to the name Alexei. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes, the same color as her brother S in my memory, filled with tears. She spoke rapidly in Russian, and Anya translated, her own voice thick with emotion. She says she remembers the day her mother wrote this letter. She was a little girl. She says her brother Alexei was only 19. They never knew what happened to him. He was just missing, presumed dead. Svetlana took the letter from my hands as if it were a holy relic. She unfolded it, her gnarled fingers trembling, and she began to read it aloud, her voice a soft, weeping song. Didn't need a translator for that. I knew what it said. It was a mother's love, a sister's news, a plea to come home safe. After 50 years, the words were finally heard by the person they were meant for. Svetlana looked up at me, and the suspicion was gone, replaced by a profound, weary gratitude. She took my hand, this old woman whose brother I might have killed, and she said, through Anya, "Thank you for bringing him home." We sat at her kitchen table, and she brought out a photo album. There he was. Alexei, a handsome boy with a shy smile in his crisp new uniform, taken just before he left. It was him, the boy in the snow. And in that moment, the weight I had carried for half a century, the cold that had lived in my bones since that winter, it just lifted. It was gone. I had finally completed my long, strange duty. I had delivered the letter. The war, you know, when they talk about the war in the big books, they talk about strategy, about movements, about generals and battles with names. But for us, for me and my buddies in our frozen hole in Russia, the war had a different name. It was called hunger. That gnawing empty feeling in your gut was an enemy just as real as the Ivans across the field. It was a constant companion, a dull ache that never really went away, even after you choked down your rations. Those rations, God, what I wouldn't have given for a real meal. We get this canned meat. They called it Old Man, this greasy, stringy stuff that you had to force down. A single cigarette was worth more than a medal sometimes. You trade a whole can of meat for one lousy cigarette, just for the few moments of pleasure, of feeling like a human being again, watching the smoke curl up into the cold air. We had these little stoves, tiny things we'd burn anything we could find in, and we'd huddle around it, our breath steaming, and we'd play this game. We'd describe the meals we were going to eat when we got home. Not fancy meals, mind you, real food. Karl, he was from Bavaria, he'd describe his mother's roast pork with such detail you could almost smell the crackling, the way the fat would sizzle. He'd talk about the dumplings, soft and fluffy, and the rich brown gravy. I'd close my eyes, and I could see my own mother's kitchen, the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, the way the butter would melt on a warm slice. We'd describe it until our stomachs were growling so loud we had to stop, but for those few minutes we weren't soldiers in Russia. We were just boys back home, dreaming of food. That hunger, it does something to you. It strips away everything else. All the talk of fatherland and glory, it just evaporates when you're that empty. You become an animal just thinking about your next meal. The cold was bad, sure. The fear of an attack was worse. But the hunger was always there, a bass note underneath everything else. It was the first thing you felt when you woke up, and the last thing you thought about before you tried to sleep, shivering in your greatcoat. You'd dream of food, real food, and wake up with your mouth watering, only to have that metallic taste of canned meat waiting for you. It's a kind of madness, I think. And then something happened that I still can't quite explain, not even now. It started across the field, in the Russian lines. There was a stretch of no-man's-land, just a frozen field with a shattered farmhouse in the middle. We noticed one of them, a single soldier, would appear sometimes, not to shoot, just to be there. We'd see him, and he'd see us. After a while it became a kind of game, a silent understanding. One afternoon I was feeling bold, or maybe just desperately sick of Old Man, and I took a can of our rations and I walked out, not all the way, just a few meters from our line, and I placed it on a broken piece of wall from that farmhouse. I held my hands up. My heart was pounding, I tell you. I thought for sure a sniper would get me, but nothing happened. I went back to my hole. The next morning we looked, and the can was gone, and in its place was a bottle of their vodka. It was crude stuff, burned your throat, but my God, the warmth it sent through your frozen body, it was like a piece of the sun. After that it became a thing, not every day, but sometimes. We'd leave a can of meat or some bread, and he'd leave a bottle or once a small sack of potatoes. We never spoke. We never got closer than 100 meters. But we had this truce, built on hunger. Built on the simple fact that we were all just men over there, stuck in the mud and the snow, wanting the same thing, to fill our bellies and see another sunrise. It was the most human thing that happened to me in all those months. In those moments, trading food, we weren't Germans and Russians. We were just hungry. It made the shooting feel, I don't know, stupid, like children playing a terrible game. We'd even wave sometimes, a quick, furtive gesture. I often wondered about him, that Russian. Did he have a family? Was he as scared as I was? I think he was. I think he was just a boy like me. That fragile peace couldn't last, of course. Nothing good ever did out there. The big push came, the orders from on high, and all hell broke loose. The shelling was relentless. The world just turned into noise and dirt and screams. We went forward, or what was left of us did. It was a blur of fear and violence. When it was over, the field was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. The silence of the dead. We were moving through what was left of the Russian positions, checking for, well, you know what we were checking for, and that's when I found him. I'm almost certain it was him. He was lying near that same broken farmhouse. He was young, younger than I was. He had this look on his face, not of pain, but of surprise. And in his hand he was still clutching a piece of black bread. It was half-eaten. He must have been eating it when it happened, just having his meal. I stood there looking down at him, and my own hunger was a roaring beast inside me. I hadn't eaten properly in days. That piece of bread, it was all I could see. It was stupid, it was dangerous, but I knelt down. My hands were shaking. I looked at his face, then at the bread. I knew I shouldn't, but the hunger was too strong. It was a physical force. I reached for the bread, and my fingers brushed against his. They were already cold. As I pried the bread from his stiffening grip, I felt something else in his pocket. A folded piece of paper, smudged with dirt and something darker. A letter. I don't know why I took it. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something else. I tucked it into my own pocket, and then I looked at the bread. I sat down right there next to him, my back against the wall, and I ate it. I ate his bread. It was coarse, dense, sour, but it was real bread. And as I chewed, I felt this connection. This terrible, intimate connection. I was eating the last thing he ever tasted. It was like a final communion between us. The boy who traded vodka for meat, and me. We were sharing a meal just like we had before, but this time it was different. This time it was forever. The taste of that bread, it's still with me. It wasn't just the taste of rye flour. It was the taste of his life and my survival, all mixed together. I sat there for a long time, just staring at nothing, the crumbs still on my lips. After that, the letter stayed in my pocket. At first, I told myself I'd try to get it to his family, but how could I? The war kept going, and we kept retreating. It became a part of me, that folded piece of paper. It lived in the same pocket as my own letters from home. It got soft around the edges from being handled. I never could read it, of course. It was in Cyrillic, just strange, beautiful squiggles to me, but I didn't need to read it. I knew what it was. It was the same as the letters I carried from my mother, from my sweetheart. Full of the same things, hopes, worries, love, the mundane details of a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away. How is your sister? The apple tree blossomed early this year. We miss you. It was all in there, I knew it. That letter was him. It was the humanity I had felt during our little trades. It was a reminder that the boy lying in the mud wasn't a faceless enemy. He was a son, maybe a brother, maybe a father. He was a man who got hungry, you know. They teach you to hate the enemy. Drill it into you. They're a faceless horde, monsters, subhuman. It makes it easier, I suppose. Easier to pull the trigger when you don't have to think about the man on the other end of the sights. But out there, in the frozen mud of the Eastern Front, that idea started to crack for me. It didn't shatter all at once. No, it was like ice on a pond in spring, little fissures, spreading every day, until the whole thing just couldn't hold. It started with the faces. We were dug in along this God-forsaken stretch of front, outside some burnt-out village whose name I've long forgotten. The kind of place where the cold didn't just nip at you, it gnawed right down to the bone. You'd wake up with your beard frozen to the collar of your greatcoat, your breath a cloud of steam in the dugout that seemed to freeze and fall as a fine, bitter dust. The world was white and grey, the trees just black, skeletal fingers scratching at a sky the color of lead. And across the field, maybe 200, 300 meters away, were their positions. The Ivans. At first, that's all they were. A flicker of movement in a trench line, the glint of a scope, a muzzle flash in the twilight. But during the days, during the long, tense stretches of quiet between artillery barrages, you'd start to see them. A sentry stretching his back, another one boiling water over a tiny, desperate flame, the smoke a fragile grey thread against the vast whiteness. You'd see them as shapes, then as men. They had their routines just like we did, their own small rituals for staying sane. And there was one in particular. He had a red scarf, a splash of colour in all that monotony. And he'd always be there in the late afternoon, perched up on the parapet for just a moment, and he'd wave. Not a big, grand gesture, just a slight, almost hesitant lifting of the hand. My buddy Klaus, he saw it too. He nudged me once, his teeth chattering. "Look at that fool, Erich. Does he think we're at a parade?" But after a while, Klaus would just grunt when he saw it. It became part of the landscape, like the crows that picked at God knows what in the Narman's land between us. I found a strange comfort in that little wave. It was a crack in the facade, a reminder that over there, in that trench smelling of damp earth and boiled cabbage just like ours, was another young man who was cold and scared, and probably just as sick of the whole damn war as I was. It was a secret between us, a tiny, unspoken truce that existed for 5 seconds each day. I never waved back, mind you. That would have been too much. But I'd give a little nod when I was sure no officer was watching. A nod he couldn't possibly see from that distance, but I felt he knew. It's funny what you cling to. Then came the day the shooting stopped. Not for an hour, not for a few minutes. It just stopped. It was the silence that was the most unnerving thing. For weeks, your world had been defined by noise, the scream of the katyushas we called Stalin's organs, the crump of mortars, the relentless crack of rifle fire. Your ears would ring with it long after it was over. But this silence was absolute, heavy, like a blanket smothering the world. It went on for hours. We were all crouched low, waiting for the trap to spring, for the massive assault we were sure was coming. But nothing happened. Just that eerie, pressing quiet. Then word came down the line. A temporary local ceasefire. A few hours to retrieve the wounded and the dead from the frozen field. I was picked for one of the parties. Let me tell you, stepping out over the parapet into Narman's land without firing your weapon felt like the most unnatural act in the world. Your every instinct screams at you to get down, to hide. The snow was stained dark in places, and the shapes lying there, well, you tried not to look too close. The cold had preserved them in a horrible kind of way. We moved cautiously, a couple of us covering while others checked for signs of life. And then I saw him. Across the field, a similar party of Russian soldiers had emerged. And there he was, the man with the red scarf. He was doing the same thing I was, moving slowly towards one of their fallen. Our eyes met across maybe 50 meters of churned-up earth and snow. He stopped. I stopped. Time seemed to freeze solid. I could see his face clearly now for the first time. He was young, maybe younger than me, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes under his Ushanka. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, just like the rest of us. There was no hatred in his look, no animosity, just a weary recognition, a shared understanding of the grim task at hand. He gave that same slight wave, this time a bit more deliberate. Then he gestured with his head towards the wounded man at his feet. I nodded. It was a conversation without a single word. You go tend to yours, I'll tend to mine. We won't interfere. It was the truce made real. For the next hour, we worked in that strange, parallel existence. I'd glance up and see him helping a comrade limp back to their lines. He'd see me and my buddy France dragging a stretcher. There was a respect in that silence, a humanity that the generals and the politicians had tried to beat out of us. It was the most profoundly decent thing I experienced in the entire war. The fighting started again a day later, of course. The war didn't care about our little moment of peace. It was a brutal assault. One of those frontal attacks that made no tactical sense, just throwing bodies at a problem until it went away. Or until you ran out of bodies. We beat it back, but it was costly. When things quieted down again, we were sent out to police the field, to gather identification and booby-trap the enemy bodies so they'd be a nasty surprise for their own retrieval parties. A grim business. That's when I found him. I was turning over a body slumped against a shattered tree stump, and the world just dropped out from under me. It was him. The red scarf was still there, now spattered with dark, frozen blood. His eyes were open, staring at the grey sky, seeing nothing. That young face I'd seen just days before, full of a weary life, was now pale and waxy. I remember sinking to my knees in the snow beside him. It wasn't like losing one of my own comrades, not exactly, but it was a different kind of grief. A grief for the waste of it all, for the stupid, pointless loss of this man I'd never spoken to, but with whom I'd shared a fragile understanding. I felt a hot, stupid anger rise in my throat. Why him? Why this man who had shown a spark of kindness? Why any of us? My hands were shaking as I went through his pockets, looking for his soul butch, his papers. And then I saw it. Clutched in his stiff, frozen fingers wasn't a weapon. It was a letter. A piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times it was soft as cloth. I had to pry it from his grip. I couldn't read a word of it, of course. The Cyrillic script looked like chicken scratches to me, but tucked inside was a photograph. A woman, smiling with a small child on her lap. Her hair was dark like his. The child was grinning, missing a front tooth. And right then, he ceased to be a Russian soldier, an enemy, an Ivan. He was a man with a name I couldn't pronounce. A man who loved a woman and a child. A man who carried their picture next to his heart. A man who was probably writing to them about the strange German soldier who nodded at him across the field, trying to find some scrap of humanity in the madness. The weight of that letter in my hand felt heavier than any machine gun, any mortar round. It was the weight of a life, interrupted. The weight of a final message that would never be delivered. I didn't even think about it. I didn't weigh the consequences. I just knew, with a certainty that went deeper than any army order, what I had to do. I slipped the letter and the photograph inside my own tunic, right next to my own heart. I took his identification papers, too, and shoved them in my pocket. It was a decision made in a heartbeat, a promise made in complete silence. I promised him, right there, that his wife would know, that his child would know he was thinking of them at the end. I promised him that this one piece of him would make it home, even if he never would. It was a crazy thing to do. If I'd been caught with it, they'd have called me a sympathizer, maybe worse. But it was the only thing that made sense in a world that had stopped making any sense at all. That small, silent truce we had, that moment of recognition, it demanded this of me. It was a debt of honor from one soldier to another, an obligation that transcended flags and ideologies. The rest of the war became a blur of survival, but that letter was my secret anchor. Through the long retreat, through the hunger and the fear and the sight of my friends dying around me, I'd check my tunic pocket every day to make sure it was still there. It was a tiny, fragile piece of something good, something human, in a world gone utterly mad. It reminded me that the man I killed, or the man who was trying to kill me, was probably just like me, scared, homesick, dreaming of a life after the war. That letter, and the promise I made over that boy's body, defined the entire war for me more than any battle, any victory, any defeat. It taught me that the real enemy wasn't the man in the opposite trench. The real enemy was the war itself, and I carried that lesson and that letter for 50 years. You want to know what I carried? Everyone asks that. They think about the rifle, the ammo, the steel helmet that felt like it weighed a ton when you were dog-tired. And yeah, we carried those things. My Mauser, the weight of the wood stock and cold metal against my shoulder, a familiar ache. The ammunition pouches, heavy with stripper clips that clinked when you walked, a sound that said you were ready for business you didn't want any part of. We carried a mess tin, a spoon that got polished on your sleeve until it shone, a dull canteen of water that never tasted like enough. We carried dirt. In our hair, under our fingernails, ground into the creases of our skin. The Russian dirt, this thick black glue when it rained, and a fine, choking dust when the sun baked it. You tasted that dirt with every breath, smelled it on the wind, a sour mix of earth and cordite and things I don't like to remember. But that's not what you really carry, not the stuff they issue you. You carry the other things, the things that keep you from becoming just a machine. In my left breast pocket, right over my heart, I carried a photograph of my Elsa. Not a fancy one, just a small, faded thing, her smiling, that shy smile of hers, taken before I left Bremen. The edges got soft from me taking it out, looking at it in the faint light of a match, tracing her face with a grimy finger. I carried a lucky charm my little sister gave me, a smooth white stone she said came from the Weser River. It sat in my pocket with a couple of useless Reichspfennigs. You'd see the other fellas, my buddies, with their own treasures. A lock of hair tied with a ribbon, A letter from home folded and refolded so many times the creases were about to tear, a harmonica that someone would play a sad tune on when the night got too quiet. Those things, they were heavier than any rifle, because they held the weight of the world you left behind, the world you were fighting to get back to. A man could lose his rank, his rifle, even his boots, but he'd protect that little piece of home with his life. It was what kept you human in a place that was doing its damnedest to turn you into an animal. And then there were the other kinds of things men carried, the grim stuff, the souvenirs. It was a common thing, a dark habit, I suppose. After a firefight, when the shooting stopped and the silence was even louder, you'd see men going through the pockets of the dead, the enemy dead. It wasn't always about loot, not really. Sometimes it was just, I don't know, a way to make it real. To touch the fact that it had been another man over there, not just a target. You'd see a guy with a Russian watch, or a packet of their coarse cigarettes, or a propaganda booklet with Stalin's face on it. Morbid trophies from a job nobody wanted. I never had much stomach for it. It felt wrong, disrespectful. But one day it was outside of some godforsaken village. The name is lost to me now, just a smear on a map. We pushed them back, and the field was littered with the evidence. The smell. God, the smell is something you never forget. A sweet, sickly smell mixed with smoke and burnt earth. I was moving through, my boots sticking in the mud, my heart pounding still from the adrenaline, and I saw him. A young Soviet soldier, couldn't have been more than 18. He was lying on his back, his eyes open to a sky he couldn't see anymore. He had a look of surprise on his face, like he couldn't believe it was over. Something made me stop. Maybe it was how young he looked. Maybe I saw my kid brother in his face. I knelt down, not sure what I was doing. My buddy, Klaus, muttered, "Leave it, Erich. He's got nothing we need." But I saw the corner of a piece of paper sticking out of his tunic pocket. It was stained with a dark blotch at the edge. I reached out, my hand trembling, and I pulled it free. It was a letter, written in Cyrillic script, of course, which I couldn't read. But tucked inside was a small, pressed flower, a little blue thing that had somehow survived all this madness. And there was a photograph, too. A woman, his mother or his sweetheart, smiling, with a small child on her lap. And right then, it wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a souvenir of a battle won. This wasn't a piece of the enemy. This was a piece of a life just like mine. A boy who got a letter from home, who carried a picture of someone he loved, who probably dreamed of going back to his village, just like I dreamed of Bremen. His war ended right here in the mud, and this letter was all that was left of that dream. I didn't take it as a prize. I took it as a responsibility, a memory. I carefully folded it back up, the flower, the photo, the words I couldn't understand, and I put it in my own pocket, right next to the picture of my Elsa. Klaus shook his head but didn't say anything. He understood, or maybe he didn't. But from that moment I was carrying two lives, my own and the ghost of his. That letter became my most important possession. More than my rifle, more than my rations. The war turned, as you know. The great advance stalled and then reversed. The cold came, that brutal Russian winter that stole the warmth from your bones and the hope from your heart. We retreated, a ragged, exhausted column of men who were more ghost than soldier. Then came the day I was captured. It was chaos, shouting in languages I didn't understand, hands grabbing, stripping us of our weapons, our helmets, anything of value. They took my pack, my spoon, my photograph of Elsa. I fought them for that photo. I really did, until a rifle butt to my ribs convinced me otherwise. But when they patted me down, they missed the thin, worn paper in my inner tunic pocket. I kept my arms close, my body tense, praying they wouldn't find it. They didn't. They herded us together, and the long march began, the march to the camp. That march, I don't have the words to do it justice. It was a death march. Men fell from exhaustion, from hunger, from wounds that never healed. If you fell, you were left. The cold was a living thing, biting at your fingers, your ears, your soul. We were like animals, huddled together for warmth at night, our breath frosting in the air. And through it all, I protected that letter. I touched my chest through the thin, ragged fabric of my uniform just to feel the crinkle of the paper. It was my secret, my purpose. In that hell, where I had lost everything, my freedom, my friends, my picture of home, I still had this one thing to protect. It was a testament, a proof that I had seen a life end, and that I had chosen to remember it. It was a tiny, fragile piece of humanity in a world that had none left. In the camp, the Stalag, it was worse. The hunger was a constant, gnawing pain. You do anything for a scrap of food, a moment of warmth. You saw men break, become hollow, out shells. But every night, when the lights were out and the snores and whimpers of men filled the barracks, I would take out that letter. I couldn't read it, but in the faint moonlight coming through a dirty window, I could trace the handwriting. I could look at the photograph of the woman and the child. I could see that little blue flower. And it reminded me that I was still Erich from Bremen, that I was capable of something more than just survival, that a compassionate act, even one witnessed only by me and a dead boy, still mattered. It was my anchor. That letter didn't belong to me. I belonged to it. It gave me a reason to live, to make it through another day, because I was the only soul on earth who knew this boy's story, who carried his last connection home. After the war, when I finally stumbled back into Bremen, a skeleton of a man, everything was different. Elsa, she had moved on, thinking I was dead. My family was gone, the city was in ruins. The world I had fought to get back to was just a memory. I built a new life, a quiet one. I married a good woman, had children, worked a job. I never talked about the war, not the real war. The stories you tell are the easy ones, the funny ones about the bad food or the stubborn sergeant. You lock the rest away, but I never locked away that letter. I kept it in a small wooden box on my dresser. My wife, she knew it was important, but she never asked. It was just part of me. For 50 years it was there. I'd take it out sometimes, on certain days. The anniversary of when I was captured, or just a quiet evening when the memories got too loud. I'd unfold it carefully, the paper so fragile now it felt like it might turn to dust in my hands. I'd look at that young soldier's face in my mind, and I'd talk to him. I'd tell him I was sorry. I'd tell him I was still keeping it safe. It was my secret penance, and that's the thing, you see. Over those 50 years, the souvenir stopped being something I possessed. It became something that possessed me. I was its caretaker. It was a duty I never asked for, but one I could abandon. How could I throw it away? It wasn't mine to throw away. It was the last piece of that boy. I was just the guardian. It felt like if I lost it or destroyed it, then his life, his memory, would truly be erased from the earth. And I couldn't let that happen. I had carried it through too much for that. The letter owned me. It was a quiet, constant burden, a ghost from 1943 that shared my house, my life. Then, a few years ago, my grandson, he's a good boy, he was learning about the war in school. He asked me if I had anything from it. And for the first time, I showed someone. I showed him the letter. He was fascinated. He said, "Opa, we should find out what it says. We have the internet now. We can find out." And my heart just stopped. The thought of it, after all these years, to hear the words, I was terrified. But he was right. It was time. We found a man, a translator, a professor at the university. I handed him the box, my hands shaking like they hadn't since I was a young man under fire. He put on white gloves and opened it with the care of a priest. I read the words aloud slowly. It was from the boy's mother. Her name was Anya. The soldier's name was Alexander. She wrote about their village, about the cow giving milk, about his little sister Masha, who missed him terribly. She told him to stay warm, to be careful, that they were praying for him every day. She ended it by saying, "Come home to us, my son. We wait for you." He never got that letter. I did. I carried it for him, and right then I knew. My duty wasn't to keep it safe in him. My duty was to let it go, to send it home. The professor helped me. It took time, but we found them. A cousin of Alexander's, an old woman now living in Minsk. We sent the letter back to her. I got a letter from her, translated. She thanked me. She said they had never known what happened to Alexander. They just knew he was missing. Now they knew. Now they could lay him to rest in their hearts. When I put that letter in the mail, it was like a weight I had been carrying for half a century just lifted. I felt light. The burden was gone. I had finally completed my task. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was just an old man who had kept a promise he never actually made to a boy he never knew. You carry things in a war. You carry the weight of your gear, the weight of fear, the weight of your friends who didn't make it. But sometimes, you carry something that gives you a reason to keep going. That letter was my reason. It was a strange, sad souvenir, but it was the most human thing I ever owned. And in the end, by letting it go, I finally brought us both home. You know, they tell you war is about territory, about flags on a map, big ideas. But when you're in it, up to your knees in mud and God knows what else, it's not about any of that. It's about the weight of your pack, the cold that gets right into your bones and stays there, the taste of stale black bread, and the face of the boy you just killed. It's that last one that stays with you. Not the big ideas, just the face. For me, it was one face, a Russian boy, and he's been with me for 50 years. He became a ghost I carried right here in my pack. We were outside this burned-out village. The name, S gone now, blurred away with all the other names on maps we tore up for cigarette paper. The fighting had been fierce, a real meat grinder. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and cooked earth and something else, something sweet and rotten that you never get used to. The snow was dirty, churned up with mud and stained dark in places. We were moving through what was left of a birch grove, the trees splintered like matchsticks, and that's where we found them. A scattered group of Soviet soldiers, cut down in a skirmish a day or two before. My unit, just a handful of us left from the original lot, we were scouting, nerves shot, jumping at every shadow. You get a feel for death after a while, you know. You can smell it. We moved through them, not out of disrespect, but because you had to be sure. You'd nudge a body with your boot, heart hammering in your throat, terrified it might groan and sit up, or that a booby trap would send you to meet your maker. My buddy Klaus, he was always the joker. Even then, he muttered, "Well, they're not collecting any more medals, that's for sure." Dark humor, it was the only thing that kept you from screaming. I saw him then. He was younger than me, I think. Couldn't have been more than 18. Lying on his back, looking up at the grey, indifferent sky. He didn't look angry or heroic, just surprised. His face was pale, almost peaceful, except for the single, neat hole in his forehead. He was just a boy. A kid from some farm, probably same as me. His uniform was shabby, and his hands were still curled, empty. Something made me stop. The others moved on, checking the other bodies, but I was stuck there, looking at him. It felt wrong to just leave him like that, another piece of litter on this God-forsaken landscape. I knelt down. I don't know why. Maybe it was a prayer, though I'd forgotten most of them by then. And that's when I saw the corner of it, peeking out from the inside pocket of his greatcoat, a letter wrapped in oilskin to keep it safe. My hands were trembling from the cold or the fear, I don't know. I pulled it out. The paper was crisp, the ink a faded blue. I couldn't read a word of it, of course. Cyrillic script, all loops and angles that meant nothing to me. But I could see a name, written carefully at the top, and a woman's name at the bottom. A mother, a sweetheart. And there was a little drawing, a clumsy flower next to the name. That little flower did me in. This wasn't just a soldier. This was a son, a boy who loved someone, who drew flowers on his letters home. Taking that letter felt like I was taking a piece of his soul. It was a stupid, sentimental thing to do. I could have been shot for hesitating, for looting, but it wasn't looting. It felt like a duty, a promise I hadn't even spoken. I slipped it into my own breast pocket, right over my heart. It felt like it was burning a hole there. From that moment on, he was with me, that Russian boy. He wasn't a ghost that haunted me with screams or blood. He was quiet, a quiet ghost in my pack. Through the long retreats, the endless marches where your feet bleed in your boots, through the stinking closeness of a foxhole with shells screaming overhead, he was there. I'd feel the crinkle of the paper when I shifted my pack. In the rare moments of quiet, huddled under a ground sheet with rain drumming a funeral march above, I'd take it out. Not to read, but just to hold. That oilskin packet became my secret. My buddies talked about their girls back home, showed around photographs faded with sweat and grime. They talked about the food they'd eat, the beer they'd drink, the silly, normal things they'd do. I'd just listen and nod, and feel the weight of that letter in my pocket. It was my dark, silent burden. It was a connection to something human in all that madness, but it was also a chain. When the war finally ended, with that surreal, deafening silence, we were just lost. The shooting stopped, but the noise was still in our heads. We stumbled out, prisoners now, but alive. The world was supposed to go back to normal, but what was normal? I went home to what was left of Germany, a shattered country full of ghosts worse than mine. I tried to build a life. I found work. I married a good woman, a strong woman who had survived her own hell. We had children. I never told her about the letter. I never told anyone. How could I? How do you explain that you carry the last words of a boy you killed? That his ghost shares your bed, sits at your dinner table? I buried it deep, in an old tin box with my dog tags and a few other trinkets from the war that I couldn't bring myself to throw away. But you can't bury a ghost. He'd visit me at night. Not in my dreams, but in that place between sleep and waking. I'd be back in that birch grove, but it was always quiet. He'd be standing there not as a corpse, but just as a boy. He wouldn't say anything. He'd just look at me and then look down at my hands, which were always empty. And I'd wake up with a start, my heart pounding, filled with this immense, choking guilt. It wasn't the guilt of killing an enemy soldier. That was the war, that was the terrible arithmetic we were all forced into. It was the guilt of the letter. I had taken it. I had promised silently to deliver it. And for years, for decades, I did nothing. The weight of that unsent letter, it never got lighter. It got heavier with every birthday my own children had, with every Christmas, every milestone. I'd look at my son, and I'd see that Russian boy. I'd think of his mother somewhere, who never knew what happened to her son. Was she still waiting for a letter that would never come? Was she staring out a window, year after year, hoping for a sign? That thought was a cancer in my soul. The Iron Curtain came down, a wall right through the heart of Europe, and sending a letter to some village in the Soviet Union might as well have been sending it to the moon. I told myself it was impossible, but that was just an excuse, and I knew it. The truth was, I was afraid of what I'd uncover, afraid of opening a door to a past I had tried so hard to lock away. The turning point, funny enough, came from my own life. My wife, else she got sick. It was cancer, and it took her quickly. And in those final days, in that quiet room that smelled of medicine and sadness, we said everything we needed to say. There was a peace in that. A terrible, heartbreaking peace, but a peace nonetheless. There were no unanswered questions, no words left unspoken. When she was gone, I was left with the silence. And in that silence, the ghost of that Russian boy grew louder than ever. I finally understood. I finally understood the eternal, grinding grief of an unanswered letter. I imagined that boy's mother, dying with that same hole in her heart, that same lack of closure. The war had taken her son, but my cowardice had stolen his last words. I was an old man. My hands were spotted and shook a little. The world had changed around me. The wall had fallen. There was a chance now, a slim one. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my old bones, that I could not carry this ghost any longer. I could not die with this secret. It was time, for his family's sake, and for my own peace, whatever shred of it was left. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. What if I found them? What would I say? "Hello, I'm the German who killed your son 50 years ago, but here's his letter." They might spit on me. They might slam the door, and a part of me would have deserved it. But the hope, that tiny, fragile flame of hope, was stronger. Maybe, just maybe, I could give them what I had with Else. A conclusion, an end to the wondering. It took me months. I wrote letters to veterans, associations, to new archives that were opening up in the East. I had nothing to go on but a name, a woman's name, and the memory of a village that was probably just a pile of rubble. I felt like a fool, an old man chasing a ghost. But then, a miracle. Letter came back from a historian in Minsk. He thought he had found them. A family, a sister of the soldier, still alive, living in a city now, not far from where he had fallen. My hands shook so badly I could barely read the words. I wrote to her. I kept it simple. I said I was a soldier who had been there when her brother died, that I had found a letter on him, and that I had kept it all these years, and now I wished to return it to his family. I didn't say I was the one who shot him. Some truths are too heavy to send in the mail. I took a train east. The journey felt longer than the entire war. The landscapes rolling by were peaceful now, green and quiet. I clutched my small suitcase, and inside it, in the tin box, was the letter. It felt more alive than I was. I found the apartment building, a bleak concrete thing from the Soviet times. I stood outside that door for what felt like an hour, my heart thumping a ragged rhythm against my ribs. I was an old man, but in that moment I was 20 again, scared and lost. I knocked. The door opened, and an old woman stood there. She had his eyes, the same clear, light-colored eyes I had seen staring at the sky. She looked at me, this old German man, on her doorstep, and she didn't say a word. She just nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting me. She invited me in. The apartment was small, tidy, smelling of tea and old books. And there on the wall was a photograph. It was him. The same boy, but alive, smiling. His arm around a young woman who was this old lady beside me. He was whole. He was happy. He was home. I started to cry. I couldn't help it. 50 years of carrying that weight, and it all broke loose. I fumbled for the tin box, my clumsy old fingers struggling with the latch. I handed her the letter, the oilskin brittle with age. She took it, her own hands trembling. She didn't open it right away. She just held it, and then she held my hands. She spoke in Russian, soft and rapid, and her daughter, who was there too, translated. She says thank you, the daughter said, her own eyes glistening. She says she always prayed that he had not suffered alone, that someone had been with him. You have brought him back to us. We sat at her kitchen table and drank tea that tasted of smoke and flowers. She read the letter aloud, her voice cracking. It was full of simple things, things a boy would write home about. The food was bad, he missed her cooking, he hoped the war would be over by spring, he drew a flower for her. Ordinary, precious things, and as she read I felt it. The ghost he was leaving my pack. The weight I had carried for half a century just evaporated. It wasn't a loud, dramatic thing, it was quiet like a sigh. When I left, she hugged me. This woman, whose brother I had killed, hugged me and called me brother. The peace I found didn't come from forgetting. You never forget. It came from finally, after all these years, keeping a promise I made to a boy in a birch grove. I laid my ghost to rest, and in doing so, I finally set myself free.